On the night of my mother-in-law's 60th birthday, exactly 3 minutes after I handed her a gift, I had saved $487 for over 5 months to buy. She tossed it across a marble floor like it was trash. It slid under a table of crystal glasses, hit a chair leg, and everyone in that private dining room at the Sterling Crown restaurant went completely silent until she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a cold one. If you've ever had someone humiliate you in public while smiling like they were doing you a favor, you already know that sound. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a small favor. Tap, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because I want to know how many of you have ever been called family by people who treated you like an outsider, because that word family almost ruined me. My name is Daniela Cruz Moreno. I was 29 years old at the time, working double shifts as a server in a high-end steakhouse in Houston, Texas. I made about $2,700 a month on average after tips. Some weeks more, some weeks barely enough to cover rent. My husband, Evan Michael Whitmore, came from a completely different world. His family owned Whitmore Development Group commercial real estate holdings valued somewhere north of $180 million. They had lawyers on retainer, a private golf membership, and a family tradition of pretending they were humble while quietly reminding everyone they were not. I met Evan 3 years earlier when he came into the restaurant with clients. He tipped $200 on a $300 bill. He remembered my name the next time he came back. He asked about my night classes. I was studying hospitality management at a community college, paying cash each semester. He never seemed embarrassed by me. He said he admired my independence. I believed him. We got married quietly at a courthouse. No ceremony, no family blessing. His mother, Lorraine Whitmore, didn't attend. She told him she was traveling. Later, I learned she had actually been hosting a charity luncheon that day. That was the first time I understood something important. Lorraine didn't openly oppose me. She simply erased me, which, as it turns out, is much worse. For the first year of marriage, I tried everything to win her approval. I brought homemade dishes to holidays, sent handwritten thank you notes, remembered birthdays. I even memorized her favorite wine label, Chateau Margaux, 2015, about $450 a bottle, so I could save up and bring one to Thanksgiving. She accepted it without looking at me. Her daughter, Vanessa Claire Whitmore, who was 2 years younger than me and had never worked a day outside her father's company, whispered loudly at the table, "Do you think she bought it with tip money?" Everyone laughed. Evan squeezed my hand under the table, but he didn't say anything. That silence would become a pattern. The birthday party invitation arrived 2 weeks before the event. Heavy ivory cardstock, embossed gold lettering. Location, the Sterling Crown private room. Dress code formal. I stared at that card for a long time, because Lorraine had never invited me to anything before. Not once. Evan said it was a good sign. He said she was finally warming up. He said things would change. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the small voice in my gut whispering, "This isn't an invitation. It's a stage, and you're the performance." I spent weeks deciding on a gift. I couldn't afford jewelry from the store she liked. I couldn't compete with designer handbags. So I chose something else. I bought a vintage silver locket from an estate auction, a 1950s piece, hand-engraved, restored by a local artisan. Inside, I placed a tiny photo of Evan as a child that I had secretly copied from an album. On the back, I had engraved 3 words. Family begins with love. It cost me $487, which meant skipping lunches, picking up extra shifts, and delaying a tuition payment. But I believed it would matter. I believed she would see the effort. The night of the party, the private room glittered with chandeliers and white orchids. There were at least 40 guests, business partners, family friends, people who spoke in low voices and measured smiles. Vanessa wore a gold dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Lorraine stood near the head table in a deep emerald gown, perfectly styled like she was hosting a political gala instead of a birthday dinner. When she saw me, her eyes moved over me, the way you glance at a stain you plan to clean later. Not anger, not even dislike, just dismissal. I handed her the gift box with both hands. She opened it immediately, without thanking me. She looked at the locket for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said loudly, enough for the entire room to hear, "Oh, just that. Oh." Vanessa leaned in to look. Then she laughed. "Mom, it's vintage. That's code for cheap." Lorraine smiled, and that was when she tossed it. Right there in front of everyone. The locket hit the floor with a tiny metallic sound that somehow felt louder than a gunshot. Lorraine looked directly at me and said the words that still echo in my mind. "How sweet. You really shouldn't spend money you clearly don't have." Vanessa added louder. "Yeah, it's kind of sad when people try to pretend they belong." A few guests chuckled nervously. Evan said nothing, not a single word. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not explosively, not dramatically. Quietly, like a door closing. I bent down, picked up the locket, and held it in my palm. Lorraine was already turning away, greeting someone else, as if I had disappeared. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 30 seconds later. Because as I stood there, holding that locket, one of the Whitmore family attorneys, Robert Hensley, stepped closer to Lorraine and handed her a thin envelope. And when she opened it, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My name, printed at the top of a legal document. And Lorraine smiled at it, like she had been waiting a long time to use it. I didn't know it yet, but that envelope would destroy my marriage and expose a betrayal worth more than $12 million. Tell me honestly, if you saw your name on a legal paper at a party meant to humiliate you, would you walk away quietly? Or would you stay long enough to find out what they were planning? Because I stayed, and that decision changed everything. 10 minutes after I saw my name printed on that legal document in Lorraine Whitmore's hand, she folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and laughed as if she had just received a birthday card instead of something that made my hands go numb. She didn't look at me, but she didn't have to, because she knew I had seen it. Before we go further, if you've ever had that moment, the one where your stomach drops because you realize something has been happening behind your back for months, tell me in the comments what tipped you off. I read every story, and trust me, you're not alone in this. I stood there, holding the locket, my palm sweating against the cool silver. Evan was across the room talking to 2 of his father's former business partners. He hadn't seen the envelope, or maybe he had and chose not to react. I wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. Lorraine's attorney, Robert James Hensley, was a tall man in his early 60s with a polished voice and the kind of calm that only comes from billing $650 an hour. I knew his name because Evan had mentioned him before. He handles everything for the family, he once said. At the time, I didn't understand what everything really meant. Now I was about to learn. Lorraine tucked the envelope into her emerald clutch and turned back toward me, smiling the way someone smiles at a waiter who just spilled water. "Oh, Daniela," she said lightly, "you should go sit. You must be exhausted from standing all day." A few nearby guests smirked. Vanessa added, "Yeah, your feet must hurt. That's what happens when you live on tips." It wasn't just the insult. It was the tone. They weren't angry. They were entertained, like I was a small, predictable show. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I didn't cry. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled, not warmly, not politely, just enough to make them uncomfortable. Then I said quietly, "Thank you for inviting me, Lorraine." I used her first name deliberately. She noticed. Her eyes sharpened for half a second. Then she turned away. Dismissed. I walked to the edge of the room, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Houston. The city lights reflected in the glass, making it look like two skylines stacked together. One real, one illusion. Evan joined me a few minutes later. He looked tense, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when he didn't want to deal with something. "Hey," he said softly, "don't take it personally. You know how my mom is." That sentence, "don't take it personally," it's amazing how often people say that when something is deeply, painfully personal. I kept my voice calm. "Why does she have legal paperwork with my name on it?" Evan froze, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. "What are you talking about?" he said. I held his gaze. I saw it. Robert handed it to her. He looked away first. And in that moment, I knew. Not everything. "But enough." He exhaled slowly. "It's nothing serious," he said. "Just some paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" "Just family business stuff." "Why is my name on family business stuff?" His jaw tightened. "Daniela, can we not do this tonight?" That was when the second shift happened inside me. The first had been when the locket hit the floor. The second came when I realized something even colder than humiliation. He wasn't surprised, which meant he already knew. And he hadn't told me. I asked one more question. "Is it about money?" He hesitated. Too long. Then he said quietly, "It's complicated. There's a sentence that should come with a warning label, because it never means complicated. It means hidden." At that moment, Vanessa walked over with 2 champagne glasses. She handed one to Evan, ignored me, and said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "You should tell her, Evan. It's not like she'd understand the numbers anyway." He snapped Vanessa stop. She just smiled. And then she looked directly at me and said something that didn't make sense at the time, but would later become one of the most important clues. "You know what's funny," she said. "Some people don't even realize they've already signed away everything." My heart skipped. Signed what? When? I had never signed anything for the Whitmore family. At least, not knowingly. I felt a cold wave move through my chest. Vanessa, Evan said sharply, but she only shrugged. "Relax. She'll find out soon enough." She walked away, leaving the words hanging in the air like smoke. I turned to Evan. What did she mean? He didn't answer. He just stared at his champagne glass. And in that silence, I felt something crack. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a thin fracture spreading under the surface. Because silence can be louder than shouting. I asked again, slower this time. "What did I sign?" He finally spoke, but his voice was tight. "Remember last year, when we refinanced the condo?" My stomach dropped. Yes. We had refinanced the small condo we lived in, a $310,000 unit in Midtown Houston. He had handled most of the paperwork because he said he was familiar with real estate documents. He told me it was routine, standard forms. I had trusted him, signed where he pointed. "What about it?" I whispered. He swallowed. "There were additional documents included." My ears rang. "What kind of documents?" He looked at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw fear in his eyes. "Daniela," he said quietly, "it's not what you think." That's another sentence that always means exactly what you think. But before he could say anything else, Lorraine's voice cut across the room. "Everyone," she announced brightly, "it's time for the toast." Guests gathered near the head table. Glasses lifted, smiles returned, and Lorraine looked directly at me as she raised her champagne. Her eyes were calm, confident, certain. Then she said something that made the room laugh and made my blood run cold. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate not just another year of life, but the importance of protecting what truly belongs to our family." People clapped. I stood frozen, because as she said the word protecting, she tapped the emerald clutch where that envelope with my name was hidden, and I realized something terrifying. Whatever I had signed, it wasn't an accident. It was a plan, one that had been unfolding long before that birthday party. And I still didn't know the worst part, because 2 minutes later, as the waiter placed a leather folder in front of Lorraine for her speech notes, It slipped open slightly, just enough for me to see one line of text inside the document. A number, $12,400,000. Next to my name, and the word, transfer. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But somehow, I had just become the center of something worth over $12 million. And Lorraine Whitmore looked very, very pleased about it. On the drive home from Lorraine Whitmore's birthday party, exactly 18 minutes after I saw the word transfer next to my name and a number that looked like a lottery jackpot, Evan turned off his phone, gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and said nothing for the entire 11.4-mile trip. The silence felt heavier than any argument. If you've ever sat next to someone you love and suddenly realized they might not be on your side anymore, tell me in the comments. Did you confront them immediately? Or did you wait until you had proof? Because that decision changes everything. Houston traffic blurred past in streaks of red taillights. My reflection in the passenger window looked pale, almost unfamiliar. I kept replaying what I had seen. My name. $12,400,000. Transfer. It didn't make sense. I didn't come from money. My parents ran a small auto repair shop in San Antonio that barely broke 6 figures a year. The largest amount I had ever personally handled was a $3,200 tuition payment. $12 million might as well have been another planet. We reached our condo, a modest 2-bedroom unit on the 9th floor of a brick building that smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. Inside, Evan dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter with a sharp, metallic clatter. I didn't sit. I didn't take off my heels. I asked one question. What did I sign? He rubbed his face. Daniela, it's complicated. No, I said quietly. It's paperwork. Paperwork isn't complicated. It's specific. He exhaled slowly. You remember when my dad passed 2 years ago? Yes. I remembered the funeral, the black suits, the whispered conversations about inheritance. At the time, I stayed in the background, invisible as usual. His estate, Evan continued, included multiple commercial properties, office buildings, warehouses, things like that. I know. One of them was transferred into a trust. Okay, he hesitated. And then the truth began leaking out in fragments. The trust needed a neutral beneficiary. The phrase made my stomach tighten. What does that mean? It means someone not directly tied to Whitmore Development. Someone who could legally hold the asset without triggering certain tax and liability issues. My heart started pounding. Evan, I said slowly, did you use me? His eyes flickered. That sounds worse than it is. It's always worse than it sounds. He continued quickly. It was just a formality, a legal structure. The property was always controlled by the family. What property? He swallowed. A downtown commercial building, the Preston Financial Tower. The name hit me like a physical blow. I knew that building, 32 floors, prime location, estimated value over $60 million. I had served cocktails at a corporate event there once. And my name is on it, I whispered. Technically, yes. My hands began to shake. You made me a legal beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar asset without telling me. It wasn't like that, he said defensively. It was temporary, just for tax protection. That was when the third shift inside me happened. Not fear, not humiliation. Clarity, because I realized something simple. If it was harmless, he wouldn't have hidden it. How long, I asked. What? How long have I been the beneficiary? His answer came in a low voice. 14 months. 14 months. For over a year, my name had been tied to a multi-million-dollar property. Without my knowledge, without my consent, my voice stayed calm. And the refinancing paperwork, he looked down. That's when the trust documents were included. I felt something inside my chest turn cold and steady. You told me those were routine mortgage forms. They were mixed in, he said quickly. You signed them. It's legal. Legal? That word landed like ice. There's a difference between legal and ethical. between lawful and right. I walked to the sink and stared at my reflection in the dark window. "So tonight," I said slowly, "what was that document Lorraine had?" He hesitated again. That hesitation told me more than any answer. "It's a transfer authorization," he admitted. "To transfer what?" "The trust asset." "To whom?" Silence. Then finally, "Back to the family. Back." As if it had always belonged to them. As if I were just a placeholder, a name on paper, a disposable buffer. I turned around. "Without telling me." "They don't need to tell you," he said quietly. "You already signed the consent clauses last year." The words hit like a physical slap. Consent, clauses, legal traps hidden inside routine paperwork. I realized something horrifying. I had never owned anything. Not really. I had been used as a shield, a legal firewall, a disposable name. I asked one more question. "Why now?" He hesitated. Then he said something that made the entire situation snap into terrifying focus. "Because the IRS audit window is closing." I blinked. "What?" "There's a 5-year period where asset transfers can be reviewed for tax liability. The family needed to hold the building under an outside beneficiary during that time." Outside. That was me. And now I whispered, "Now it can safely be transferred back without triggering penalties." The room felt very quiet, very still. "So the birthday invitation," I said slowly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. It wasn't a celebration. It was a closing ceremony, a performance, the moment they planned to finalize everything. My humiliation had been entertainment and timing. I felt something settle inside me. Then, not rage, not heartbreak, something colder, a realization. Because if my name had been on that trust for 14 months, that meant something else was also true, something Evan clearly hadn't considered. I asked softly, "Evan, did you ever check whether the trust allowed unilateral transfers?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" I held his gaze. "I mean, are you absolutely sure the beneficiary has no control?" He opened his mouth, then paused. Because for the first time that night, he wasn't certain. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. For 14 months, I hadn't just been a placeholder. Legally, I might have been something far more dangerous. Because there was one detail no one had explained yet. One piece of information hidden inside documents I had never read. And Lorraine Whitmore's confidence at that party suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. Because people don't publicly humiliate someone unless they believe that person is powerless. But what none of them realized was this. The next morning, I was going to request a full copy of every document with my signature. And when I finally read the fine print, I would discover one clause that Lorraine, Evan, and their attorney had completely overlooked. A clause that meant the $12.4 million transfer might not be theirs to control at all. At 9:12 the next morning, exactly 14 hours after Lorraine Whitmore threw my gift across a marble floor and smiled at a document with my name on it, I walked into the Harris County Records Office and paid $42.75 for certified copies of every trust filing linked to my signature. The clerk stamped the envelope without looking at me. To her, it was routine paperwork. To me, it felt like opening a door that had been locked from the outside. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered a legal document with your name on it that you didn't fully understand at the time you signed it? Did you ignore it? Or did you dig deeper? Because what you choose in that moment can decide your entire future. I took the envelope to a quiet corner of a cafe across the street. Not the trendy kind, just a small place with cracked leather booths and the smell of burnt coffee. I didn't order anything. I sat down, opened the packet, and started reading. There were 47 pages total. The first sections confirmed what Evan had told me. The Preston Financial Tower had been placed into something called the Whitmore Transitional Asset Trust. It was valued at $61.8 million. The structure was designed to temporarily move ownership outside the Whitmore corporate network for tax shielding and liability protection during a pending IRS review cycle. My name appeared as primary independent beneficiary. That phrase made my pulse slow, not speed up, slow down, because independent meant something very specific in legal language. It meant I wasn't just a placeholder. It meant I had standing, authority. I kept reading. The trust agreement stated that control of the asset required written authorization from the beneficiary for any transfer, sale, or restructuring. I paused there. My hand rested on the paper, because that was not what Evan had implied. He had said they didn't need to tell me, but this document clearly said something else. Every transfer required my signed approval. Not pre-signed, not assumed, current authorization. I flipped ahead to the section labeled Consent Provisions. That's where I found the forms I remembered signing during the condo refinance. There they were, my signatures, dated 14 months earlier. But as I read more closely, something didn't match. The consent forms weren't open-ended. They had expiration clauses, 12 months, maximum validity, unless renewed. I did the math in my head. 14 months had passed, which meant my hands tightened on the page. Those consent documents were no longer valid. The authority to transfer the asset had expired 2 months ago. I stared at that line for a long time, because it changed everything. Legally speaking, Lorraine Whitmore could not move the property without obtaining new authorization from me. Authorization she clearly didn't have. Otherwise, there would have been no envelope, no need for her attorney, no performance at the party. That was the moment the situation flipped inside my mind. For the first time since that birthday dinner, I wasn't the one at a disadvantage. I was the gatekeeper. But that realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel something else, used. Because if Evan knew the consent had expired, then the party hadn't just been about humiliation. It had been about pressure, public pressure, social pressure, the kind designed to force someone into signing quickly, without thinking. I closed the folder and sat back. My hands were steady now, very steady. I called in sick to work that day. Not because I felt weak, because I needed time. Time to understand what they were planning. Time to decide what I would do. I spent the afternoon reading every page twice. Then I noticed something else. A clause buried near the end of the document. Clause 17.4, Beneficiary Protection Provision. The wording was dense, legalistic, almost intentionally difficult to follow. But its meaning was clear. If the beneficiary could demonstrate coercion, deception, or undisclosed financial risk at the time of signing the trust, could not be transferred until a court review determined the beneficiary had acted under full informed consent. My heart slowed even further, because I had never been informed. I had never been told the nature or value of the asset. I had never been given independent legal counsel, which meant something very simple. If I challenged the transfer, it could freeze the asset indefinitely. That wasn't just leverage, that was control. And suddenly, Lorraine's behavior made sense. Her public humiliation, her cold confidence, her insistence on social pressure. She hadn't wanted a legal confrontation. She wanted me emotionally destabilized, embarrassed, small, so I would sign quickly to make the discomfort end. But she had miscalculated one thing. Humiliation doesn't always break people. Sometimes it clarifies them. That evening, Evan came home early. He looked tense the moment he saw the documents spread across the dining table. "You went to the records office," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He exhaled heavily. "You shouldn't have done that without talking to me first." The sentence almost made me laugh. For 14 months, my name had been tied to a multi-million-dollar asset without my knowledge. And he thought I needed permission to read my own legal documents. I asked quietly, "Did you know the consent expired?" He froze, just like the night before. "Daniela," he began. That hesitation was the answer. "Yes," I said calmly. "You knew." He ran his hands through his hair. We thought you'd sign a renewal before it mattered. We thought. Not I thought. We, meaning the family, the attorney, all of them. So the party I said was meant to push me into signing. It wasn't like that, he said quickly. It was just timing. Timing. Like I was a deadline, a formality, a necessary inconvenience. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked the question that finally cut through everything. If I refuse to sign, what happens? His eyes shifted, and that was when I saw real fear for the first time. The building stays in trust, he said quietly, until it's resolved. How long? He hesitated. Years, possibly. The room went very quiet, because that meant something neither of us said out loud. For the first time in our marriage, I held power over something the Whitmore family desperately wanted. And power changes relationships. I asked one last question. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was low. Because my mother said you wouldn't understand, and that if you knew the value, you might make things difficult. I nodded slowly. There it was, the real reason. Not protection, not convenience, control. I gathered the papers neatly into a stack, and I said something that surprised him. I'm not signing anything. His face went pale. Daniela, I'm not signing, I repeated calmly. Not until I have my own attorney review everything. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't, because something fundamental had shifted. Not anger, not revenge, just boundaries. But what I didn't tell him yet was this. While reading those documents, I had found one more detail Lorraine clearly hadn't expected me to notice. A financial disclosure appendix, one that listed every transaction tied to the trust over the past 14 months. And one entry, dated 8 months earlier, showed a transfer of $2.3 million to a consulting entity. An entity I had never heard of, but whose registered manager's name made my chest tighten when I read it. Vanessa Claire Whitmore. And suddenly, this wasn't just about tax shielding anymore. It was about money that had already moved, money that might not have been legal to move at all, which meant Lorraine's urgency wasn't just about reclaiming the building. It was about hiding something before I discovered it. And now, I already had. At 7:48 the next morning, exactly 1 day after I discovered a $2.3 million transfer tied to a trust under my name, I printed the transaction record, placed it in a plain white envelope, and drove to the only person I trusted enough to show it to. Not my husband, not anyone connected to the Whitmores. A lawyer whose name I had found buried in a Reddit thread about asset trust disputes. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you discovered financial activity under your name that you never approved, would you confront the people involved immediately? Or would you quietly collect evidence first? Because that choice can decide who holds the power. The law office of Marcus Edwin Hallbrook was nothing like Robert Hensley's polished downtown suite. It was in a 2-story brick building near Midtown, above a dry cleaner, and next to a pawn shop. His waiting room had mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that looked older than me. But the moment he walked in, I understood why his name had come up so often in legal forums. He didn't smile. He didn't try to charm me. He just sat down across from me and said, "Tell me everything in order." So I did. From the refinance paperwork 14 months ago, to the trust documents, to Lorraine's birthday party, to the expired consent clause, to the $2.3 million transfer linked to Vanessa. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. I shook my head. He slid the printed record closer to me. "This," he said calmly, "tapping the page is not just a questionable transaction. It's potentially unlawful misappropriation." The words landed slowly. "Heavy? What does that mean?" I asked quietly. "It means," he said, "that funds were moved from an asset legally under your beneficiary control without your authorization." My pulse quickened. Even though the family owns the trust, he shook his head. Legally, they don't. Not until a valid transfer occurs. He paused. Right now, Daniela, you are the controlling beneficiary of a $61 million asset. Hearing it stated so plainly made my chest tighten. I had never asked for this, never wanted it, but it was real, and it came with responsibility. And that $2.3 million I asked. He looked at the document again. That appears to have been transferred as a consulting payment to an entity managed by Vanessa Whitmore. Yes. Did you approve it? No. Did you know about it? No. He nodded slowly. Then it's a problem. A serious one. My stomach sank. What kind of problem? A legal one that could trigger investigations into breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent transfer, and possibly tax violations. The room felt colder because suddenly this wasn't just a family conflict. It was something that could involve courts, audits, criminal liability. I asked quietly, why would they risk that? He answered without hesitation. Because they believed you wouldn't look. That sentence cut deeper than anything else he'd said. Because it was true. For 14 months, I hadn't questioned anything. I trusted my husband, trusted his family, trusted the system, and trust had made me blind. Marcus leaned forward slightly. There's something else you need to understand, he said. I listened carefully. Based on the timing, he continued that transfer occurred while your consent was still legally active. But it still required disclosure to you. I frowned. So it wasn't automatically illegal. Not automatically, he said. But failure to inform a beneficiary of major disbursements can be considered a violation of fiduciary duty. He tapped the page again. And if it can be shown that this payment was made to a related party without proper documentation, it becomes much more serious. I swallowed. What should I do? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question. Do you want to protect yourself? Or do you want to confront them? The distinction mattered. Protecting myself meant legal distance. Confronting them meant escalation. I thought of Lorraine's cold smile, Vanessa's mocking laughter, Evan's silence, and something inside me settled into clarity. I want to protect myself first, I said. He nodded approvingly. Good. Then he outlined the next steps. Step 1. File a beneficiary information request, legally requiring full disclosure of all trust transactions. Step 2. Formally notify the trust administrators that no transfer authorization would be granted until independent review was complete. Step 3. Document all evidence of non-disclosure and potential coercion. It sounded calm, methodical, but I understood what it really meant. This would put the Whitmores on notice. And once they realized I had legal representation, things would change quickly. Before I left, Marcus said something that stayed with me. Daniela people like the Whitmores rely on two things, silence and speed. If you slow them down, they lose control. I nodded, and for the first time since the birthday party, I felt something steady inside me. Not anger, not revenge, just awareness. That afternoon, I returned home and found Evan sitting at the kitchen table. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept. We need to talk, he said. I placed my bag down calmly. So do I. He stared at the documents in my hand. You hired a lawyer, he said quietly. Yes. He closed his eyes briefly. My mother is going to lose her mind. I didn't react, because that wasn't my concern anymore. He looked at me again, and there was something desperate in his expression now. You don't understand what you're doing, he said. I answered calmly. No, I understand exactly. He leaned forward. If this goes public, it could destroy my family's business. I held his gaze. Then maybe your family shouldn't have used me without telling me. He flinched at that, but he didn't argue. Instead, he said something that made my stomach tighten. There's something you don't know yet. I didn't speak. I waited, because silence makes people reveal more. He swallowed. That $2.3 million transfer, it wasn't just Vanessa. My pulse slowed. What do you mean? He hesitated, then finally said, my mother authorized it personally. The words hung between us. Cold, heavy, because that changed everything. It meant Lorraine wasn't just humiliating me out of social contempt. She had a direct financial reason to ensure I stayed powerless, to ensure I never looked closely, to ensure I signed whatever she needed. And suddenly, her confidence at that birthday party made perfect sense. She wasn't just protecting the building, she was protecting herself. Because if that transaction was exposed, it wouldn't just be embarrassing, it could be catastrophic. But Evan wasn't finished. He looked at me with something close to fear now. "Daniela, if you push this, you're not just fighting my mother." He paused, then said quietly, "You're going to discover things about this family that you won't be able to forget." I met his eyes calmly, because by then, I already knew something he didn't. I had just filed the beneficiary information request, and legally, they now had 15 business days to disclose every single transaction tied to that trust, including one entry near the bottom of the ledger, a payment dated 3 months ago for $780,000, labeled simply Legal Contingency Reserve. And the recipient of that payment was Robert James Hensley, Lorraine's attorney, which meant this wasn't just about money moving quietly inside the family. Someone had already anticipated a legal fight and prepared for it, long before I even knew my name was involved. At 10:03 on the following Monday morning, exactly 4 business days after my attorney filed the beneficiary information request, a courier delivered a 212-page disclosure packet to my front door, stamped urgent in red, and signed by Robert James Hensley himself. The timing alone told me everything. They weren't ignoring me anymore. They were reacting. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. When someone who once treated you like you didn't matter suddenly responds quickly and formally, do you feel relieved, or do you feel afraid of what they're trying to control? Tell me in the comments, because that shift in behavior always means something. The packet was heavy, thick, cream-colored paper tab sections, professional formatting, the kind designed to look authoritative and overwhelming at the same time. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I called Marcus Halbrook. He arrived within an hour, carrying a yellow legal pad and a quiet, focused expression. We sat at my dining table, and he opened the disclosure carefully, like someone handling evidence rather than paperwork. "Remember," he said calmly, "this is their version of the truth, not necessarily the full truth." I nodded, because I understood now. Documentation can hide as much as it reveals. The first section listed basic trust, activity maintenance, expenses, insurance payments, lease income from the Preston Financial Towers tenants. All legitimate, all routine. But as we moved deeper into the packet, the financial transactions became more complicated, layered, structured. Marcus flipped to a section marked Special Disbursements. "That's where we focus," he said. The first major entry was the one I already knew. $2,300,000. Consulting agreement, Whitmore Strategic Advisory, LLC. Manager Vanessa Claire Whitmore. Date 8 months ago. Marcus circled it with his pen. Notice something he asked. I looked closer. "There's no attached contract," I said. He nodded. "Exactly. Any legitimate consulting fee of this size would include detailed service documentation." "So what does that mean?" "It means it may have been a disguised internal transfer." My stomach tightened. "So basically, they move money to Vanessa under a fake justification." "Potentially," he said. He turned the page. The next entry was the one that had caught my attention earlier. $780,000, Legal Contingency Reserve, Hensley and Rourke, LLP. Date 3 months ago. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a large prepayment for legal services. Is that unusual?" "Not by itself," he said, "but the timing matters." He tapped the date. 3 months ago. Long before you requested anything, which meant something very clear. Lorraine had anticipated a legal challenge. Before I even knew the trust existed, a cold realization settled over me. This wasn't just financial maneuvering. It was preparation, like someone setting up defenses before a battle. Marcus flipped another page, and then he paused for a long moment. What I asked quietly? He didn't answer immediately. He just turned the packet toward me and pointed at a transaction near the bottom of the page. $1,050,000. Emergency Asset Stabilization Fund. Recipient, Whitmore Development Group. Operating account. Date, 2 months ago. 2 months ago. My heart skipped. That was exactly when my consent authorization expired. Why is that important? I asked. Marcus's voice was very calm. Because this transfer happened after your legal consent window closed. I stared at the number. That means, he said quietly, this transfer may have occurred without lawful beneficiary authorization. The room felt suddenly smaller, colder, because this wasn't just one questionable transaction anymore. It was a pattern, money moving under my name, without my knowledge, without my consent, and now possibly without legal authority. Marcus leaned back. If this holds up, he said, it's extremely serious. I swallowed. How serious? He looked directly at me. It could trigger a civil fraud investigation. The words landed heavily, because suddenly, the stakes were far beyond family drama, beyond humiliation. This could involve lawsuits, regulators, even criminal exposure. I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anger, and something else, clarity, because I finally understood Lorraine's urgency at that birthday party. She hadn't just wanted me to sign, she had needed me to sign. Without my signature, those transactions could be challenged. Without my cooperation, her legal position was fragile. Marcus closed the packet. You need to prepare for escalation, he said. What kind? He didn't hesitate. They're likely going to try to pressure you socially, emotionally, possibly financially. I nodded slowly, because that had already begun. He continued, they may also attempt to frame this as a misunderstanding rather than wrongdoing. That made sense. The Whitmores valued reputation above everything. Admitting wrongdoing would destroy their image, so they would likely deny, deflect, minimize. Before he left, Marcus gave me one final instruction. Document everything from now on. Every conversation, every message, every interaction. I agreed, because at this point, trust was no longer an option. That evening, Evan came home later than usual. He looked tense, his tie loosened, his eyes tired. My mother wants to meet, he said immediately. I didn't react. When? Tomorrow. Private lunch. Just you and her. I held his gaze calmly. Why? He hesitated, then said quietly, she says this has gone too far. I almost laughed. Too far, as if filing a legal request about my own name was an overreaction. What does she want? I asked. He swallowed. She wants to explain. Explain. That word sounded harmless, but I knew better now. Explanation often meant persuasion or manipulation. I asked one more question. Will her attorney be there? He nodded. Yes. That confirmed everything. This wasn't a conversation. It was a negotiation, possibly an attempt to regain control. I said calmly, my lawyer will attend. Evan closed his eyes briefly. She won't like that. That's not my concern. He didn't argue. He just sat down heavily in a chair. After a long silence, he said something that made my chest tighten. You don't understand how ruthless she can be when she feels threatened. I met his eyes. Then she shouldn't have threatened me first. He looked away, and in that moment, I realized something painful but clear. The distance between us was no longer just about trust. It was about loyalty, and he was standing somewhere in the middle, unable to choose a side. But what he didn't know yet was this. When Marcus and I had finished reviewing the disclosure packet, he had found one more document buried near the end. A memo, not meant for public release, marked internal confidential, dated 6 months ago. And the subject line of that memo read, Risk Assessment, Beneficiary, Non-Compliance Scenario, which meant something very chilling. Lorraine Whitmore hadn't just been reacting to my resistance. She had been planning for it, long before I even knew there was anything to resist. And whatever that memo contained, it would reveal exactly how far she was willing to go to keep control. At 12:26, the next afternoon, exactly 34 hours after I received the 212-page disclosure packet and found a confidential memo titled Risk Assessment, Beneficiary, Non-Compliance Scenario, I walked into a private dining room at the Riverstone Club and sat across from Lorraine Whitmore without bringing a single document with me. I didn't bring papers. I didn't bring notes. I brought silence. If you've ever had to sit face to face with someone who tried to control you and you realized the most powerful thing you could do was say, "Less, not more, tell me in the comments," because silence, when used correctly, can be louder than any argument. Lorraine was already seated when I arrived. Emerald blazer, pearl earrings, perfect posture. She didn't stand to greet me. She didn't smile. She just watched me sit down like someone observing a piece on a chessboard. Robert Hensley sat beside her, a leather folder in front of him. My attorney, Marcus Halbrook, sat next to me, his yellow legal pad resting quietly on the table. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Lorraine finally broke the silence. "Daniela," she said, her tone cool, but controlled the situation has become unnecessarily complicated. I didn't respond. She continued, "We believe there has been a misunderstanding." Still, I said nothing. She shifted slightly, clearly expecting a reaction. When she didn't get one, she tried a different approach. "You've always been emotional," she said calmly. "It's understandable that you might feel overwhelmed by complex financial matters." Marcus's pen paused on his pad, but I still didn't speak, because I wasn't there to defend myself. I was there to listen. And when people aren't interrupted, they reveal more than they intend. Lorraine leaned forward slightly. "The trust arrangement was never meant to harm you," she said. "It was simply a temporary structure for asset protection." Silence. "You were compensated indirectly," she added. "Living expenses, housing support, financial stability." My eyes met hers, and I saw something subtle, not confidence, calculation. She was testing which argument would move me. When none of them worked, her tone shifted. "More direct now. We need to resolve this quickly," she said. "Prolonging the situation creates unnecessary legal exposure for everyone." Marcus finally spoke. "Miss Whitmore," he said evenly, "my client is reviewing the disclosures carefully. Several transactions appear to have occurred without proper beneficiary authorization." Lorraine's expression didn't change. "That is incorrect," she said smoothly. Marcus slid a single page forward. "The $1.05 million stabilization transfer occurred after consent expiration." A flicker. Just a small one, but it was there. Lorraine turned her gaze to Hensley. He cleared his throat. "That transfer was made under Emergency Asset Preservation Authority," he said calmly. Marcus didn't react. "Which still requires beneficiary notification," he replied. Hensley's jaw tightened slightly. The room grew quieter, and for the first time, I saw Lorraine adjust her posture. She shifted from dismissive to strategic. "Daniela," she said directly, "now we are prepared to offer you a generous resolution." There it was. The pivot. From denial to negotiation. I remained silent. She continued. "In exchange for immediate transfer authorization, the family is willing to provide you with a financial settlement." Marcus glanced at me. I gave no signal. Lorraine spoke clearly now. $500,000. The number hung in the air. $500,000. For someone who made under $40,000 a year, it was life-changing money. But I didn't react, not even a blink, because something inside me had shifted in the past week. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth, control, respect. Lorraine noticed my lack of response. Her tone hardened slightly. "This is an extremely generous offer," she said. Marcus responded calmly. "My client is not negotiating at this time." Lorraine's eyes sharpened. "This situation will not end well for you," she said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight, a subtle threat, the kind delivered without raising a voice. Marcus didn't respond. Neither did I, because silence forced her to continue. And she did. "You need to understand something," Lorraine said, her voice lowering. "You do not have the resources to sustain a prolonged legal conflict." She leaned forward. "The Whitmore family does." There it was. The real message: power, pressure, intimidation. I finally spoke, for the first time in the meeting, and my voice was very calm. "I'm not fighting your family," I said. Lorraine blinked, a small, involuntary reaction. "Then, what are you doing?" she asked. I held her gaze steadily. "I'm protecting myself." The simplicity of the statement landed harder than any accusation, because it couldn't be argued, couldn't be twisted. Lorraine leaned back slowly, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something close to uncertainty in her eyes. The conversation ended shortly after. No agreement, no resolution, just a polite, tense exit. But the real shift happened outside the restaurant. Evan was waiting in the parking lot. When he saw my expression, he knew immediately. "It didn't go well," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, it went exactly as expected." He looked exhausted, like someone watching two worlds collide. After a long silence, he said something that made my chest tighten. "My mother isn't going to stop." I met his eyes calmly. "I know." He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "There's something else you need to understand." I waited, because by now I had learned the most important truths come after hesitation. He swallowed. "That memo you found." My pulse slowed. "Yes." He looked at me with something close to guilt. "I saw a copy of it months ago." My heart skipped, and I asked quietly. He hesitated, then said, "It wasn't just a risk assessment." A cold stillness settled inside me. "What was it?" I whispered. He looked away, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "It outlined steps to discredit you if you refuse to cooperate." The words landed like ice, because suddenly, everything made terrifying sense. The humiliation, the pressure, the urgency. They hadn't just planned for resistance. They had planned to destroy my credibility. Before I even knew there was a fight, and Evan wasn't finished. He took a slow breath. "There was one line in that memo I'll never forget," he said. I waited, my hands completely still. He looked at me again and said quietly, "If the beneficiary becomes non-compliant, initiate reputation containment protocol." Reputation containment, a corporate phrase, cold, clinical, dehumanizing. I didn't ask what it meant, because deep down, I already knew. And within 48 hours, I would find out exactly how far Lorraine Whitmore was willing to go to make me disappear. 41 hours after Evan told me about something called a reputation containment protocol, and exactly 9 days after Lorraine Whitmore threw my gift across a marble floor, I walked into my restaurant shift at 5:02 p.m. and discovered I had been removed from the schedule without warning. No explanation, no call, just erased. If you've ever shown up to work and realized someone had already started dismantling your life behind your back, tell me in the comments, did you panic or did you get very, very quiet? Because what you do in that moment decides who controls the next chapter. I stood in front of the manager's office door for a full 10 seconds before knocking. Inside, my supervisor, Craig Dalton, looked uncomfortable the moment he saw me. He didn't even pretend. "Daniela, we need to talk." That phrase again, the polite version of something unpleasant. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "What happened?" I asked calmly. He shifted in his chair. "There's been a situation." I waited. Silence makes people fill the gaps. He finally continued. "We received a formal complaint." My pulse slowed instead of speeding up, because now I understood. This was the first move. "What kind of complaint?" I asked. He hesitated. "Allegations of misconduct involving a guest." The words hung in the air, carefully chosen, vague, serious. My voice stayed steady. "What misconduct?" He opened a folder and read from a printed statement. "Accusations that you requested personal financial assistance from a high-profile client while on duty. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so precise, so targeted, so clearly fabricated by someone who understood exactly what would damage my credibility. "I've never done that," I said calmly. He nodded quickly. "I know. Your record is spotless." "Then why was I removed from the schedule?" He swallowed. "Because the complaint came from a major corporate client, someone with significant influence. I didn't need to ask who. I already knew." Lorraine Whitmore didn't fight loudly. She fought quietly. Through systems, through reputation, through leverage. "How long ago was this complaint filed?" I asked. Craig glanced at the paperwork. 2 days ago. 2 days, which meant something very clear. She had filed it the morning after our legal meeting. Not before, not weeks earlier. Immediately after realizing I wouldn't cooperate. The timing wasn't subtle. It was strategic. "What happens now?" I asked. He sighed. "Corporate requires an internal review. Until then, you're on unpaid suspension." Unpaid. The word landed with cold precision, because Lorraine knew exactly how I lived. Paycheck to paycheck. Rent due on the 1st. Student tuition installments every 8 weeks. This wasn't just an attack on my reputation. It was pressure. Financial pressure. The kind designed to force quick decisions. Craig lowered his voice. "I'm sorry, Daniela. Off the record, this feels wrong." I nodded. "I know." He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "If you can clear this quickly, you can come back." I didn't answer, because something inside me had shifted again. I wasn't thinking like a victim anymore. I was thinking like someone watching a pattern unfold. I left the restaurant without arguing, without raising my voice, without defending myself, because Marcus had warned me, document everything, react to nothing. At home, I wrote down every detail of the conversation. Time, exact wording, dates. Then I called Marcus. He wasn't surprised. "This is textbook reputation pressure," he said calmly. "What do?" I asked. "You don't engage emotionally," he replied. "You respond legally." He explained the next step. We would send a formal notice to the restaurant, demanding disclosure of the complaint source and supporting evidence. If the accusation was proven false, it could establish a pattern of retaliatory conduct tied to the trust dispute, which would strengthen my legal position significantly. For the first time since this began, I saw the larger strategy. Lorraine wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was creating a narrative, one where I looked unstable, unprofessional, untrustworthy, so that if the conflict became public, people would doubt me before hearing the facts. It was ruthless, but also predictable, because people who rely on reputation always attack reputation first. That night, Evan came home later than usual. He looked shaken. "What happened at work?" he asked. I held his gaze calmly. "You already know." He didn't deny it. He just sat down heavily. "My mother. She says she didn't do it." I didn't react, because that wasn't important. Intent could be denied. Timing could not. I said quietly, "It doesn't matter what she says." He rubbed his face. "This is getting out of control." I answered evenly, "No, it's becoming clear." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear. Not for his mother, for himself. "Daniela," he said, "if this escalates, everything could collapse." I met his eyes. Then, maybe it was built on something unstable. He didn't respond, because deep down, he knew that was true. But what I didn't tell him yet was this. Earlier that afternoon, Marcus had called me back after reviewing the internal memo more closely. He had found a second attachment linked to it, a contingency timeline. And in that timeline, there was a section labeled Phase 2, Financial Pressure Implementation. Underneath it were 3 bullet points: employment disruption, credit interference, housing vulnerability, which meant something very chilling. The suspension from my job wasn't the end of the plan. It was only the beginning, and the next move would hit somewhere far more personal. At 6:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 days after I was suspended from work, I opened my banking app to pay rent and discovered that my checking account balance had dropped from $8,942 to negative $312 overnight. Not gradually, not through spending, gone in a single transaction. If you've ever experienced that cold moment when you realize money you depend on has vanished without warning, tell me in the comments, did you panic first or did you check the transaction history before reacting? Because that order matters more than you think. I didn't panic. I clicked the transaction log. There it was. One line, $9.254. Automated payment, joint account settlement. My pulse slowed because I immediately understood what had happened. Evan and I shared a joint account that covered the condo mortgage, utilities, and insurance. But I also kept a personal savings account linked to it, separate in practice, but technically accessible through the joint authorization structure. I had trusted that arrangement. That trust had just cost me almost $9,000. I called the bank. The representative confirmed calmly the withdrawal was authorized through a co-account holder request. Co-account holder, Evan, or someone acting under his authority. I thanked her politely and hung up. No anger, no shock, just confirmation. Because Marcus's warning echoed clearly in my mind. Phase 2, financial pressure implementation, employment disruption, credit interference, housing vulnerability. This was step 2, a precise, calculated move designed to destabilize me financially. I called Evan. He answered on the third ring, sounding exhausted. Did you withdraw money from our joint account? I asked calmly. Silence. Then, my mother told me to consolidate assets temporarily. The words landed with surgical coldness. Without telling me, I asked. He exhaled heavily. She said it was necessary to protect the family from potential liability. Protect. That word again. Used to justify control. I spoke slowly. You drained my personal savings. It was technically part of the joint structure, he said quietly. Technically? Legally. Those words had become weapons. I asked one more question. Did you know this would leave me unable to pay rent? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. That silence didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like confirmation. I hung up without arguing, because emotional reactions would only weaken my position. Instead, I called Marcus. He wasn't surprised. Involuntary asset withdrawal within a contested legal dispute can strengthen a coercion claim, he said calmly. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means they're helping you build a legal record. The irony almost made me smile. Lorraine thought she was tightening control. In reality, she was leaving evidence. Marcus instructed me to document everything and immediately separate all remaining financial links. Within hours, we filed an emergency notice freezing further withdrawals tied to the trust dispute. By afternoon, another development arrived. A certified letter from my landlord. Subject line, notice of payment irregularity. It wasn't an eviction notice yet, but it was a warning. Rent was due in 6 days. And without access to my savings, I was suddenly at risk. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was coordination, because financial instability creates emotional vulnerability, and emotional vulnerability leads to rushed decisions. Lorraine wasn't trying to win legally. She was trying to exhaust me psychologically. That evening, Evan came home earlier than usual. He looked pale, like someone who had just realized the consequences of a decision. Daniela, he said quietly, we need to fix this. I sat across from him calmly. There's nothing to fix. He shook his head. You don't understand. My mother says this will spiral if you keep resisting. I met his eyes. It already has. He hesitated, then said something that confirmed everything. She believes you'll sign once you feel enough pressure. I didn't react outwardly, but inside something solidified, because hearing it stated so plainly removed any remaining doubt. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about strategy. I asked quietly, Evan, do you agree with her? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was low. I don't want to lose my family, The sentence felt heavier than any accusation because it revealed the truth clearly. He wasn't choosing me. He was choosing stability, loyalty, the world he'd always known. And that realization didn't break me. It freed me, because once you know someone's priorities, you stop expecting them to change. I nodded slowly. I understand. He looked relieved, like he thought I was surrendering. He didn't realize what I actually meant. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone at the dining table and opened the contingency memo Marcus had given me. I read it again carefully, but this time, I focused on something different. Not the threats, the assumptions. Lorraine had built her entire strategy around one belief: that I would react emotionally, that I would panic, that I would act quickly under pressure. But she had miscalculated something fundamental. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing, because earlier that afternoon, Marcus had finalized something we'd been working on quietly. A legal filing that would change the entire power dynamic overnight. A beneficiary protective injunction request. If granted, it would freeze all trust-related financial movements, require a full forensic audit, and legally prohibit any retaliatory actions against me tied to the dispute. It was a defensive move, not aggressive, but its consequences would be enormous, because once filed, it would bring the situation into public legal record, which meant Lorraine could no longer control the narrative privately. She would have to defend herself openly, but there was one more detail Marcus revealed before submitting it, something that made my hands go still when he said it. During his preliminary review, he had traced the $2.3 million consulting payment further, and the funds hadn't stayed with Vanessa's company. Within 3 weeks, they had been transferred again into a personal investment account, owned not by Vanessa, not by Lorraine, but by someone else entirely, someone whose name I never expected to see connected to this. Evan Michael Whitmore, my husband. And suddenly, this wasn't just a battle between me and his family anymore. It was something much closer, much more personal, and far more dangerous. At 11:03 a.m. on a humid Tuesday morning, exactly 6 days after I learned that $2.3 million from the trust had quietly ended up in my husband, Evan Whitmore's, personal investment account, a process server handed Lorraine Whitmore a court-stamped injunction notice in the middle of her quarterly shareholder luncheon. 72 executives were in the room, 2 financial reporters, and at least 1 local business news camera. She didn't know I would choose that moment, but I did, because if someone tries to destroy you privately, sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to move the truth into the light. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you discovered someone you loved had secretly benefited from money tied to your name, would you confront them privately, or would you force the truth into the open where it couldn't be denied? Tell me in the comments, because that choice changes the entire outcome. The injunction filing had happened the previous afternoon. Quietly, methodically, Marcus submitted it with a 142-page evidence package. The expired consent documentation, unauthorized transfers, proof of employment, retaliation timing, bank withdrawal records, internal memo excerpts, and the transaction trail showing how funds moved from the trust to Vanessa and then into Evan's personal account. By law, the court required immediate notification to all involved parties, which meant Lorraine found out in the most public way possible, through a legal document handed to her while she was standing in front of investors. Marcus later described her reaction to me in a single sentence. She didn't explode. She froze. That was worse. Because people like Lorraine don't show emotion easily. When they do, it means something fundamental has shifted. By that afternoon, the consequences began unfolding rapidly. First came the legal effect. The injunction froze all trust-related activity. No transfers, no withdrawals, no restructuring, everything locked until a formal hearing. Second came the reputational ripple. Because the injunction filing entered public record immediately, And within hours, a local business news site published a short article. Whitmore Development Asset Dispute moves to court. It didn't include accusations. It didn't take sides. But it mentioned one key fact. A family trust beneficiary had filed legal action alleging unauthorized financial activity. Lorraine's greatest vulnerability had always been exposure, not legal risk, public scrutiny. That evening, Evan came home looking like he had aged 5 years. He didn't sit. He didn't remove his jacket. He just stood in the doorway, staring at me. "You filed a court injunction," he said quietly. "Yes." His voice trembled slightly. "You've made this public," I answered calmly. "I made it documented." He shook his head slowly. "My mother is furious." I didn't respond, because that wasn't new information. He took a step closer. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked. I held his gaze. "It means the truth will be reviewed by a court." He flinched, because we both knew that wasn't what he meant. He meant reputation, business stability, family legacy. He said it directly next. "If this goes to a full hearing, everything could come out." I nodded slowly. "That's the point." The words landed between us like a wall, because for the first time, he understood something clearly. I wasn't trying to negotiate anymore. I was trying to protect myself completely. He ran his hands through his hair. "There has to be another way," he said. I asked quietly, "Was there another way?" When my job was targeted, silence. When my savings were taken, silence again. "Was there another way?" When your family planned to discredit me. He closed his eyes. And for the first time since this began, he didn't defend them because he couldn't. After a long pause, he said something that made my chest tighten. "I never thought it would go this far." I believed him, not because he was innocent, but because he had underestimated his mother's strategy and overestimated his ability to stay neutral. But I wasn't finished. There was one truth he still hadn't acknowledged. I asked quietly, "Evan, why did the money end up in your account?" His face drained of color. He sat down slowly. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally, "My mother told me it was temporary." Temporary. That word again. She said it was safer to hold it under my name during a restructuring period. "Did you ask where it came from?" I asked. He looked down. I didn't want to know. The honesty of that answer hurt more than any lie, because it revealed something simple. He had chosen comfort over truth. I asked one final question. "Did you know my name was still tied to the trust when that happened?" His silence confirmed everything. And in that moment, something inside me settled completely. Not anger, not heartbreak, just clarity. Because I finally understood the full picture. This wasn't just Lorraine's plan. It was a system of silence, one where everyone benefited from not asking questions. Until someone did. And now I had. But the public exposure was only beginning. 2 days later, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing, and Lorraine made a decision she believed would regain control. She requested that the hearing be held with full public record access. She thought transparency would intimidate me. She thought it would pressure me to settle quietly before the details emerged. What she didn't realize was this. Marcus had already prepared something far more powerful than documents. A witness, someone whose testimony would directly connect Lorraine to the unauthorized transfers. Someone she believed would never speak against her. Because for years, he had worked inside her legal team. Robert James Hensley, her own attorney. And when Marcus told me that Hensley had quietly agreed to testify under subpoena, I realized something chilling. Lorraine Whitmore's greatest strength control was about to become her greatest weakness. Because once people inside a system start telling the truth, no amount of reputation can hold it together. And the hearing would not just expose financial misconduct. It would reveal something far more devastating. A decision Lorraine had made months earlier. That would prove she never saw me as family at all. At 9:07 a.m. on the morning of the preliminary court hearing, exactly 17 days after Lorraine Whitmore threw my gift across a marble floor and called it cheap, she's walked into Harris County Civil Courtroom 4B wearing a tailored navy suit and a smile so calm it almost looked rehearsed. By 11:42 a.m., that smile would be gone. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you knew the person who humiliated you was about to face the truth in front of strangers, would you feel satisfaction or just exhaustion? Tell me in the comments, because revenge doesn't always feel the way people expect. The courtroom was larger than I imagined. Cold lighting, neutral walls, rows of wooden benches filled with observers, some legal interns, some business reporters, some people who simply came to watch. Because high-profile financial disputes always attract attention. Lorraine sat at the front beside her legal team. Perfect posture, chin slightly lifted, like she was attending a board meeting, not a court hearing. She didn't look at me when I entered, but she knew I was there. Marcus sat beside me, calm, as always, flipping through a binder marked with color-coded tabs. Evan sat behind his mother, looking pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't spoken to me in 3 days, and that silence felt final. The hearing began formally. Lorraine's attorney argued first. He framed the situation exactly as expected. A family misunderstanding, a temporary administrative oversight, no malicious intent. He emphasized the Whitmore family's reputation, their charitable work, their long-standing business presence. It was a polished performance, professional, confident. Then Marcus stood, and the tone of the room shifted immediately. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He just presented facts. Chronologically, methodically, expired consent documentation, undisclosed financial transfers, employment retaliation timing, unauthorized withdrawal from joint accounts. Each piece of evidence placed carefully into record. The judge listened quietly, occasionally taking notes. Lorraine's expression remained calm, controlled, but I noticed something subtle. Her fingers tightened slightly around a pen. Because this wasn't emotional storytelling. It was structural exposure. Then came the turning point. Marcus said calmly, "Your Honor, we would like to call a witness to clarify internal authorization procedures tied to the trust transactions." Lorraine's head turned slightly, her first visible reaction, because she already knew who it was. Robert James Hensley. He walked to the stand with slow, measured steps. No eye contact with Lorraine, no hesitation. He was sworn in. And then Marcus asked the first question. "Mr. Hensley, were you involved in preparing internal legal assessments regarding the trust beneficiaries' potential resistance?" "Yes," he answered. "Did those assessments include planning for reputational pressure against the beneficiary?" Lorraine's attorney immediately objected, but the judge allowed the question. Hensley spoke calmly. "Yes, internal memos outlined steps to manage noncompliance risk." A murmur moved through the courtroom because the language sounded cold, corporate, calculated. Marcus continued. "Did those plans include initiating external complaints against the beneficiary's employment?" Hensley paused, then answered, "Yes." The word landed heavily because it confirmed something publicly for the first time. Lorraine's strategy wasn't reactive. It was planned. Marcus moved to the next question. "Were you aware of financial transfers from the trust to entities connected to family members?" "Yes." "Did those transfers occur with full beneficiary disclosure?" Hensley looked directly at the judge when he answered. "No." A stillness settled over the room, the kind that only happens when truth becomes undeniable. Lorraine's composure shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened, because this wasn't speculation anymore. It was sworn testimony. Then Marcus asked the question that changed everything. "Mr. Hensley, did Lorraine Whitmore personally authorize the $2.3 million transfer to Whitmore Strategic Advisory, LLC?" Hensley answered clearly. "Yes." Lorraine's attorney stood immediately, objecting, arguing context. But the damage was already done. The narrative had broken. Lorraine finally reacted. She leaned forward sharply and whispered something to her legal team. For the first time, her calm had cracks. Marcus asked one final question. Was there ever an internal acknowledgement that the beneficiary had not been fully informed of the trust's scope and financial risks? Hensley took a breath, then said, "Yes." That single word shifted the emotional balance of the entire courtroom, because it established something critical. Not just financial mismanagement, deception, systematic, intentional. When Marcus finished, the judge called a brief recess. Lorraine stood immediately and walked out with her attorneys. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just controlled retreat. Evan remained seated, still staring at the floor. After a long moment, he finally looked at me. His eyes were red, not angry, not defensive, just hollow. "I didn't know it would come out like this," he said quietly. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to explain. Some truths, once spoken publicly, closed doors permanently. The hearing resumed an hour later, and Lorraine's strategy shifted exactly as expected. First came denial. Her attorney argued the transfers were administrative errors. Then came deflection, blaming complex financial structures. Then came victim positioning, claiming she had acted to protect family assets. But the most telling moment came near the end. Lorraine herself requested to speak. Her voice was calm, controlled, but no longer confident. "I have spent 40 years building this family's stability," she said. Her eyes briefly flickered toward me. "And sometimes difficult decisions must be made to preserve something larger than one individual's feelings." The sentence revealed everything. Not anger, not hatred, just hierarchy. To her, I had never been a person. I had been a variable, an administrative tool, and now a liability. The judge closed the session by confirming that a full forensic audit would proceed. All trust activities would remain frozen. Further hearings scheduled. But the real outcome wasn't in the legal rulings. It was in what had already happened. Lorraine Whitmore's control had collapsed publicly. Her authority had been questioned under oath, and her reputation, her most carefully protected asset, had been permanently altered. But there was one more truth that hadn't surfaced yet. One final detail Marcus revealed to me later that evening. Something found during the deeper financial audit. A document Lorraine had personally signed months before the birthday party. A contingency clause authorizing legal removal of me as beneficiary under one condition: if I could be proven financially unstable or ethically unreliable, which meant something very clear. Long before that birthday humiliation, Lorraine Whitmore hadn't just planned to use me, she had already planned to erase me. And now, that plan would be exposed in the final hearing. In front of everyone she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. On a quiet Thursday afternoon in early autumn, exactly 63 days after Lorraine Whitmore threw my gift across a marble floor and called it cheap, I sat alone on a wooden bench beside a small lake in Herman Park and watched a line of ducks move steadily across the water. No lawyers, no documents, no courtrooms, just stillness. If you've ever reached the moment after a long battle where everything finally becomes quiet and you realize you don't feel victorious, just calm, tell me in the comments. Because that kind of peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from understanding what you will never accept again. The final hearing had happened 3 weeks earlier. It lasted less than 4 hours, because by then, most of the truth had already been established through forensic audit findings. The numbers were precise, unemotional, impossible to argue. Over 14 months, a total of $4.13 million had been moved from the trust through layered transfers tied to internal entities. Not all of it was unlawful, but enough had occurred without disclosure to establish clear fiduciary violations. Lorraine's legal team attempted one last strategy: minimization, administrative error, complexity, confusion. But the audit trail didn't support that narrative. It showed signatures, authorization chains, internal memos, decisions made deliberately. The judge's ruling was measured and restrained. No dramatic language, no emotional commentary, just structured consequences. The trust would remain under independent court supervision. All prior unauthorized transfers would require restitution. And Lorraine Whitmore was formally removed from any administrative authority tied to the asset. That was the legal outcome, but the emotional outcome was quieter, more personal, more final, because 2 days after the hearing, Evan and I sat at our kitchen table one last time and spoke honestly, without lawyers, without defenses, without pretending. He looked tired, older, like someone who had been standing between two collapsing walls. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. I believed him, not because he was innocent, but because intention and impact are not the same. "You didn't protect me either," I answered calmly. He didn't argue, because he knew that was true. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Is there any way back from this?" I looked at him carefully, not with anger, not with bitterness, just clarity. And I answered with the sentence that later became the one people repeated most when they heard this story. "Trust isn't something you lose all at once. It disappears one silence at a time." He closed his eyes when I said that, because he understood. There wasn't one moment that ended us. There were dozens, small ones, quiet ones. Each time, he chose comfort over truth, loyalty over honesty, avoidance over protection. We finalized the divorce 6 weeks later. No public drama, no legal war, just a clean separation. He kept his family's world. I kept something far more valuable, my boundaries. Lorraine never contacted me again, not once. Through mutual business circles, I heard that Whitmore Development remained financially stable, but its internal leadership changed significantly after the audit. Reputation doesn't collapse overnight, but it shifts, quietly, permanently. As for me, the trust situation resolved gradually over the following months. Under court supervision, the Preston Financial Tower was eventually transferred into a neutral institutional trust structure. I received a legally mandated beneficiary settlement, not millions, not revenge money, just a structured compensation of $620,000, enough to pay off debts, finish my degree, and start something new. I left the restaurant industry, not because I was ashamed, because I was ready for something different. Today, I manage operations for a small hospitality consulting firm in Austin. It's not glamorous, it's not powerful, but it's stable, honest, quiet, and sometimes quiet is the greatest luxury. That afternoon in the park, as I watched the water ripple under soft sunlight, I thought about the silver locket Lorraine had thrown across the floor. I still had it. I kept it in a small wooden box at home, not as a reminder of humiliation, as a reminder of clarity, because that moment, when it slid across cold marble, was the first time I truly saw the truth. And truth once seen cannot be unseen. Before I end this story, I want to ask you one final question. Have you ever mistaken acceptance for love? Because I did, for a long time, until I learned something that changed everything. Real family doesn't test how much you can endure. They respect the moment you say no. If this story meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most. And if you want to hear another story about quiet strength, hidden betrayal, and the moment someone finally chooses themselves, stay with me, because the next one begins with a wedding toast and a secret hidden inside a champagne glass.